there's something I want to talk to you about, and I want you to listen closely, because this is really important, okay? When B movies start receiving critical acclaim, it is a sign that something very wrong has transpired. B movies have a very specific economic and cultural position in the film industry. The term B movie comes from the distribution model of early film. The true golden age of the movie theater was around the 30s and early 40s. Before TV was invented, spending like 4 or 5 hours in a movie theater was considered a pretty reasonable way to spend an entire afternoon. So what movie theaters would do, since they were typically in that day also owned by studios, is they would sell one ticket for the day's showing, which would usually include a newsreel, a short, a top-billed feature, and another sort of bullshit filler movie as the B feature. The point was to cast a wide net, make it so that if you bought a movie ticket, your chances of seeing at least something that interests you enough to make the ticket worth it were pretty high. Take your sweetie to the B movie and make out in the back row, you know, it's a classic American pastime. B movies were above all cheap. They didn't get a reliable return, and often they didn't have any marketing budget at all. This lack of reliable income or funding builds a couple incentives. First, it's important that B-movie studios make as many movies as possible, never investing too much time or money on any one project. We must be savage with our resources here. Nothing is precious. Second, a domino kicked over by the first incentive. If B filmmakers don't have the resources to even market their own movie, they certainly don't have the resources to be constrained by editorial concerns. Never before or since was there such a friendly mainstream market for weird shit. This means most B movies were utter garbage, there to fill a runtime, and that's it. But the combination of this lack of oversight and a market to sell to meant that every now and then, seemingly despite itself, a B movie would do something really interesting and take off as a hit in its own right. Movies like The Creature from the Black Lagoon and Curse of the Cat People appear on film school curricula now, and when we think of the defining aesthetics of decades, often what we're recalling is stuff that the educated tastemakers of the age considered embarrassing and below consideration.
That's for fucking with me, you no business born insecure motherfuckers!
Which is reflected in the nickname that was eventually assigned to the group of B-movie studios upon which theater relied. Poverty Row. The double feature model was abandoned in the 70s, but the idea of B movies never went away. And the reason for that is that garbage is important for a movie industry. I think the presence of artistic trash is a very good indicator of the health of a pop culture ecosystem. You can only subvert standards of taste if those standards exist to begin with. B movies have a kind of Freudian tone about them, you know, like you're enjoying them despite your better judgment. An existing taste superstructure is what puts us in a position to scoff at a certain class of movies as crass or uncultured, to call something gratuitous, especially in terms of sexuality or violence. These matters of taste are what separate the concept of a B movie from a movie that's just bad. They're not synonymous. The Rise of Skywalker is a breathtakingly bad movie, but it is not a B movie because its budget and corporate investment indicates that it's requesting membership in the list of texts that ought to, for whatever reason, be taken seriously. B movies are specifically not supposed to appeal to anyone's higher sensibilities or artistic appreciation. The point of a B movie is simply to elicit a reaction out of you. That knee-jerk reactivity can tell you more about what your culture values than just about anything else, which is part of the reason I started this channel. There's a characteristic lack of self-awareness to B movies. It's a genre that exists specifically because it's lowbrow, because it's in bad taste. Distribution and production models might change, but the reason the B movie has stuck around as a concept is because though there are certainly better and worse B movies, a B movie, by its nature, cannot be considered worthy of respect or public approval past a certain threshold. So when I see a franchise that made its name as one of the founding members of early 2000s shock horror and torture porn, the B movies of their day, get a response like this, it's a red flag. I get why you might think Final Destination Bloodlines is good. I understand what it's doing well. At a purely technical level, it is a better movie than at least a couple of the other installments. It doesn't feel like a cynical cash grab. The dialogue is better, the acting is better. The filmmakers clearly took the note from the response to the other movies that being hit by a truck is a lazy Final Destination death and should be used sparingly if at all.
Maybe death's not actually coming for our family. Because that would be fucking crazy. Jeez! Shit!
In fact, Final Destination Bloodlines feels almost exactly like what would happen if you made a Final Destination movie based on a checklist of what mainstream audiences didn't like about the other movies. So what's the problem with that, you may ask? Shouldn't filmmakers make the movie they think everybody wants to see? Isn't that what movies are supposed to do? No, it isn't. Have we seriously forgotten what Final Destination movies are for? Oh my god, we used to be a proper country. Okay, clearly a course review is in order. Let's start at the beginning. Final Destination is a horror franchise that began in 2001. Each movie follows a batch of young people whose wholesome group activity, school trip, amusement park visit, work retreat, etc. is interrupted by a freak accident that causes everybody's extremely violent and horrifying death. In every installment, this opening disaster is revealed to be a premonition. Whosoever saw the future justifiably freaks out and convinces as many people to leave as possible before the event comes to pass. But afterward, everybody starts dying in equally unlikely misadventures with household objects. After a couple of these deaths, our protagonist begins to understand that this is all part of a design, death itself coming back to tie up loose ends. The rest of the movie sees the protagonist gather all the people who should have died in the initial accident to figure out death's plan and avert it once and for all. Spoiler alert, they never ever succeed, except once apparently. We'll get to that later. There are 6 Final Destination movies: 1, 2, 3, The, 5, and Bloodlines, which came out a couple weeks ago. And I want to underscore the release years for these. There is a 14-year gap between Final Destination 5 and Final Destination Bloodlines. The first 5 movies were made within a 10-year time span. Think about that. In the early 2000s, there was a Final Destination movie coming out every other year, and every single one of them made its budget back many times over. And this isn't even including the 10 novels and 2 comic books the franchise spawned, and which we will not be talking about because the movies never refer to them, so I have no reason to treat them as canon. I have plenty to talk about as it is. In recent years, after the initial series has had some time to congeal as a cultural artifact, Final Destination has become a pretty big object of fascination among horror scholars because of what is considered an extremely postmodern approach to its narrative. Postmodernism is a sticky concept. It's very contrarian, very punk. It evades specificity and is therefore very vulnerable to catch-all usage for things a speaker doesn't like but also doesn't want to describe with clarity.
The postmodernists completely reject the structure of Western civilization. And I mean completely. Rationality, empiricism, science, everything. Clarity of mind, dialogue, the idea of the individual, all of that is not only, you see, it's not only that it's up for grabs. That's not the thing. It's to be destroyed. It's unbelievably authoritarian. I got a letter today from a university student in Italy. I don't know what university, but she'd been having kind of a flame war on Facebook with a social justice warrior. But she got a letter from the university saying that that violated university policy and constituted harassment, and that she should seriously consider retracting it. And that, you know, future employers might be looking at what she posted, and it was inappropriate to put that on a public site. The first thing that you might want to note about postmodernism is that it doesn't have a shred of gratitude. And there's something pathologically wrong with a person who doesn't have any gratitude, especially when they live in what so far is the best of all possible worlds. The idea that if you're in one power group and I'm in another, the idea that we can step out of that group, engage in a dialogue, have our worlds meet, and produce some sort of
understanding of each other.
Yeah, some sort of negotiated understanding. No, that's part of your oppressive patriarchal game, that idea. And so for the postmodernists, the world is a Hobbesian battleground of identity groups. They do not communicate with one another because they can't. All there is a struggle for power.
This is, by the way, a very postmodern thing to do. Tossing a word up into the air and plucking it like a string anytime you need some aesthetic flavor in your lecture, and just relying on the ambient vibes of how the word interacts with the crowd instead of a clear definition. Incredibly postmodern. Pomo king. But a term is truly only as useful as its ability to coherently describe a thing, so I will now give you a working definition of postmodernism as it applies to film specifically. Postmodernism in film is very simply the phenomenon that happens when you can no longer construct a narrative without referencing the conditions of the medium or genre you're working in. When Tarantino changes the history of the Manson murders or World War II, this is postmodern. Every time a Marvel character obnoxiously states out loud the plot beat, an event, or line of dialogue is supposed to signify,
okay, that was really good,
it's postmodern. Almost every Western made after like 1985 is postmodern by default because it's self-consciously referencing a time when Westerns were important to developing American identity before the Western plot evolved into the action movie plot and the Western aesthetic started seeming old-fashioned. If you make a Western now, you have to sell it as kind of a spin on the Western. It has to be new or different somehow, or your movie is going to underperform always and invariably. It kind of seems like under these rules, horror should always be postmodern, but it's actually really not at all. Horror troubles boundaries and questions assumptions, but there's almost always some kind of meaning to fall back on. Typically, what results in a story being understood as horrific is that there's some kind of inherent value that's being threatened. A sovereign personal identity and our ability to recognize it in others is what's being threatened in The Thing. The expectation of mutual care and affection in the nuclear family is what's being threatened in The Shining. It's tempting to argue that horror is in the business of demolishing meaning, but usually that's not the case. You're typically not supposed to be on the monster's side. That's what makes it a monster. Horror is certainly fertile ground upon which to grow some postmodernism, but usually horror comes from a disruption of some kind of reliable natural order of things having taken place. Postmodernism, on the other hand, questions how inherent that order really is to begin with. Final Destination is often described as a slasher movie without a slasher, or a grand slasher, as film scholar Ian Conrich calls it. In the slashers of the 80s, your Halloweens, your Friday the 13th, the antagonist represents the inevitable forward march of death, this silent, stalking presence ready for any opening to exploit your vulnerability. Audiences found this extremely frightening at the time, and partly because of this, it was considered by the upper crust highbrow culture wonks of the day to be tasteless and crude. But as postmodernism scholar Jean-Francois Lyotard says, a work can only become modern if it is first postmodern. Postmodernism, thus understood, is not modernism at its end, but in the nascent state, and this state is constant. By the time we get to the year 2000, the idea of a supernaturally driven and motiveless serial killer had become the new modern understanding of horror. The reason classic slasher movies are the way they are is largely because they're responding to the domestic certainty of the post-war era, this understanding created by the economic stability and social engineering of the 50s and 60s that the home should be understood as a place of safety and privacy, where a family can go about its business in comfort and mutual affection, a respite from the outside world. The slasher disrupts and contaminates this safety, which people raised to value those things found very disturbing. But eventually that becomes the new normal. Maybe the home isn't a hermetically sealed bubble where everything is safe. Maybe danger is just a fact of the world and the home is just another place for danger to make itself known. So it's a generation later, what do we do to startle people out of their complacency again? Just cut out the middleman entirely and make a villain out of the abstract concept of death itself.
What if it was our time? What if we were not meant to get off that plane? What if it still is our time?
This approach could have failed. Like a lot of B-movie ideas, it's both basic and ambitious, a goofy experiment in the way a lot of B-movies are. But this one hit hard. It became a cultural touchstone beyond anything the filmmakers expected. All the opening disasters of Final Destination are good in my opinion, but you have to understand, the opening car crash of Final Destination 2 was traumatizing to anybody who so much as saw the trailer. It is far and away the most popular opening disaster, at least according to my informal poll here, and I'd bet 2-to-1 odds that it's the most famous scene in the franchise. It ruined an entire generation's relationship to logging trucks.
Let me get in this other lane real quick.
Not like anybody had that great a relationship with them to begin with, you know. Final Destination preys on our nervousness around things we think of as precarious. The idea that you could be one loose screw away from doom, and expresses them in exactly the way it looks in your worst nightmare. This is an important distinction. Final Destination doesn't show you disasters. It shows you your nightmare of disasters. You may be relieved to hear that logs don't bounce like this. I know I was, even though when you think about it for 2 seconds, you too can realize that logs are super heavy, actually.
We did a test to first drop the logs just to see what the hell dropping, 4,000 pound logs would look like. It's scary, but they kind of fall off and then they go sliding off the road. The logs don't bounce and drop the way that we needed them to dramatically set up the rest of the sequence. So we knew that they had to be digitally created logs.
Not to say that logs falling off trucks couldn't cause a huge disaster and have in the past, but the particularities of what happens in Final Destination movies, the things that really stick in people's minds, are catastrophizations, sort of the equal opposite of a fantasy. They're obsessive ruminations over something you have limited information about and which are therefore to some extent disconnected from reality. All horror movies are a little bit disconnected from reality. All horror plays with the concept of limited information, but Final Destination depends specifically on the audience's ignorance as it's been constructed by industrial infrastructure. There is no monster on which to locate, encapsulate, and compartmentalize your fears. Death is everywhere, and everything around you can be its agent. The human mind has a huge problem, which is that we can time travel, but only in a really subjective way. Anxiety is the feeling we get when we are anticipating a bad thing whose shape we can't identify. Freud's definition still works pretty well today. Broken clocks, To Freud, the distinction between anxiety and fear is that fear is a negative anticipation toward a known threat, whereas the negative anticipation of anxiety has no object at all. It's a projection of current discomforts onto something in the future you're sure will confirm the legitimacy of those discomforts. The warning you'll hear in therapy or self-help lectures about anxiety is that we should not suffer twice, or we should not suffer in advance. A person plagued with anxiety is living in the future past, some constructed version of your own future as you envision it after this mysterious catastrophe has befallen you. The catastrophe itself has no shape, and so we, not being able to see or identify the exactitude of the thing that we're certain will cause our future past selves harm, devote our lives to figuring out what that disaster will be so that we can avoid a thing that has never happened, to ensure we'll never have to feel all the badness we're already feeling towards something that, again, has not occurred. The pathological state of anxiety is probably the average person's most common encounter with metaphysics, the study of what it means to be. In anxiety, you might not know exactly what being means, but you know it's definitely bad. Nobody becomes anxious because they expect something good to happen. As philosopher Stuart Hanscomb explains it, in anxiety, we encounter our ontology as one that is disruptive and sometimes threatening. It tells us that wherever we're standing is not stable, and, as importantly, not as stable as we usually take it to be. This instability reveals itself in a number of ways, in feelings of uncanniness, in a sense of the ineffable, in ambiguity, and in various forms of alienation. Anxiety indicates constant flux. I am this, yet I am nothing, a being which is its own nothingness. As long as we're alive, there remains at least one more possibility for us to stop existing, and that infinitely turning, kaleidoscopic set of possibilities is unbearable to a mind that, above all, craves certainty. This makes it absolutely impossible to imagine any kind of monster successfully embodying the threat posed in Final Destination. Horror scholar Noel Carroll defines a monster as something that violates classification, but in a story focused on the uniquely human ability to be stun-locked by the simultaneous truths that you are both a being that currently exists and a being who someday will exist no longer, and this ability we have to conceptualize our own future past in this context means that the only entity violating classification here is you. You, in anxiety, are always both living and dead. Gross, get away from me. A person who obsesses over all the possible ways they can die is practicing applied anxiety, which is called paranoia. They are experiencing their own death as they are still living, grotesquely neutralizing the possibility of living life by fixating on preserving life. Clear Rivers survives Final Destination 1 only to wind up in a padded room, her justified paranoia putting her in a situation where her continued life is dependent on her rejecting any contact with any of the things that constitute actually living a life. This place is empty. isolated, the walls blank except for her continued monastic study of this malicious deity that runs her life. Bloodlines also has a survivor turned death priestess, but this one lives in the middle of the wilderness, far from any possible help, on a property lined with spikes and rusty hunks of metal, and literal on-purpose death traps in a stone house full of hanging knickknacks next to a gas valve. And yes, the gas does explode. This movie is so unserious. How could any of this stuff possibly do anything but introduce potential freak accidents? This is death. This isn't Michael Myers, and she is not Laurie Strode. The entire point of the series is that death is not something you can fight with a prepper fantasy. It's something imbued into the nature of existence. Death and its permutations are infinite, and the only way you prepare for an infinitely recombinant enemy is defensively, by removing yourself from as many possibilities as you can. Prioritizing this abstracted anxiety as its own end flew in the face of how horror was understood to function at the time. Namely, nobody in Final Destination is being punished. There is no moral superstructure giving meaning to everybody's end or implying they earned or invited it somehow. For a horror series in the early 2000s, Final Destination is weirdly chaste. It's fairly sexless and drugless. There's very little implication that anyone is pushing any kind of moral boundary that accidentally releases the cause of their doom. And those that do aren't treated any worse by the narrative than those who don't. In fact, the degree of emotional disturbance these movies are capable of seems pretty attached to the mundanity of these situations and their ability to encompass the experience of a lot of different kinds of people at once. It's easy enough to avoid going to racetracks or riding roller coasters because you're freaked out by potential disasters, but everybody drives on the highway. We have to. It's a condition of the modern world, and you'd be considered pretty paranoid and silly if you refused to, even though these kinds of pileups are insanely common. The day after I rewatched Final Destination 2 for this video, one happened on the highway 20 miles from my house. These things happen. There is no metaphor in Final Destination and no meaning to the deaths you know are coming. There is nothing to learn from this situation, except like safety first, I guess.
Pays to be safe, man. Trust me.
Whether or not you're a good person will not at all affect how hot the fire that engulfs you will be when your car is ignited by an ember that drifts over from a barbecue and lands on a trail of gas spilled by a hole punched through the bottom of the car by a nail dropped by a construction worker and sent flying by a lawnmower. Or whatever. It's easy to understand Final Destination as an extremely nihilistic franchise because of this, and many people do. As Eugenie Brinkema states in her analysis of the series, if family and work are obstacles, it is not because they represent puritanical, bureaucratic, or oppressive disciplinary regimes, but because they are distractions from the urgent labor of staying alive by gleaning the signs that compose death's manifesting imminence. In place of the pursuit of pleasure, the Final Destination franchise is about anticipating, preventing, or at least delaying pain, which not a single being does. All these young adults, so recently children, every single one will expire. As far as possible from exploitation, ironic camp, or ludic play, these films are constitutively bitter, anhedonic, paranoid, and sad. I agree, it is all these things, but I will not say that it follows that Final Destination is nihilistic. There's a lot going on here beyond just a series of terrible deaths. What? You thought we were almost done just because we finished our little postmodernism primer? Adorable. Check the playhead, honey. I've barely started here. Final Destination began as an X-Files spec script by screenwriter Jeffrey Reddick, who based it off a story he'd heard about a woman whose mother begged her to switch a flight she had a bad feeling about, which then exploded in midair. This is something humans do sometimes. We make a big hay out of dogs being able to tell when earthquakes are coming and whatever, but we shouldn't short sell ourselves. Humans are great at getting weird feelings about shit. Small environmental signals we instinctively pick up on cross wires with our natural drive to make symbols and derive meaning from them to produce interpretations of situations that can only be considered creepy or overly ironic. A tableau that seems made for us, a particular song on the something that pulls us out of our autopilot and reminds us that there's a whole other world outside our isolated moment-to-moment experience and the individual goals that drive them. In the movies, these things have a one-to-one meaning. The way survival in Final Destination works is by decoding your own landscape. If you can read these symbols correctly, you can see death coming and avoid it while you continue to look for a conclusive solution. Logically, this is silly, which is frequently pointed out in the text of the movies themselves, typically right before the promise of that symbol is fulfilled.
There is nobody after us but you, trying to make us all crazy.
This gives the franchise an interesting relationship with the context of its own production. These people are all going to die because the filmmakers decree it. All the symbols the characters find and either heed or ignore were arranged that way by the filmmakers in exactly the same way they likely would if this were any other movie in any other genre. So the narrative underpinnings we all regard our own lives with are also reflected in the way the movies themselves are made as a matter of classical Hollywood cause and effect and an environment that is reflective of the inner experience of the characters. Final Destination could only have been a movie. There's a great Entertainment Weekly video released ahead of the Bloodlines premiere where the producer of the franchise goes over the design and filmmaking of every single Final Destination death, and the way he describes the set dressing is basically the same as how any other filmmaker would think about visual foreshadowing, even if the setting weren't actively trying to murder the characters.
Now, if you'll notice, there's a knife in the stained glass window in the background, and what's about to happen? Boom. She actually gets not only a pierce in the mouth, but she gets impaled in the chest with a kitchen knife. So there's a lot of foreshadowing that if you are willing or able to look, we've woven through a lot of these sequences where you actually get a chance to see what's going to happen to a character if you pay attention to their actions, the song choices, and the production design.
By the way, just as a side note, the way Craig Perry talks about these movies is the way every producer should be. He knows all the characters' names and the actors who play them. He knows all his crew members.
The actor who played Carter did a lot of his own stunts, including getting dragged and having his legs caught on fire. He was both game, and it's another example of how we try to work with our talent to make sure that we really feel the presence of the actor inside the moment so that the stunts feel really real and we're not just cutting to somebody who clearly doesn't look like the actor at hand.
The level of emotional and artistic investment he shows in these silly movies is a level of professionalism we all should aspire toward. I can't say enough good things about this guy.
Oh, that's too bad. You know, she's twice as nice now.
Once again, the cultural designation of trashiness is not a reflection of the skill involved in people's work or the kind of set they run. The freedom from cultural approval afforded to B movies means they're one of the few opportunities artists have to experiment with filmmaking strategies. Movies like this are partially effects showcases, an opportunity for filmmakers to demonstrate their ability to make a moment land.
And you'll notice here that it's a combination of a special effects makeup head, but we digitally added her actual eye onto it. So as she sort of sinks and dies, the real actress's eye is on there. And your lizard brain kind of says, oh my God, there's one real thing, and it infuses the rest of the thing with that reality. And it's one of the things that I've learned along the way, that you marry visual effects with practical. The practical will always win out because your brain is wanting to feel the truth of it and not feel the artifice.
At its best, Final Destination is a masterclass in editing for suspense. After traumatizing you with an opening disaster that's pure shock and surprise, it forces you to look at nothing but details, making sure you remain in the future past of every situation as the camera shows you the component pieces of a violent disaster that is guaranteed to occur, even if it's not immediately clear how. The root word of anxiety translates to constriction. Implied here is a narrowness of attention that excludes almost everything in your natural field of vision. Anxiety makes you reconstruct the world in the image of an event that has not yet happened, and Final Destination is on the whole extremely good at doing this on your behalf. It's constantly and cruelly teasing you and misdirecting you, forcing you to think of every possible way the set dressing in the frame could destroy a person, and only sometimes actually following through. The characters may be at the mercy of death's design, but you are at the mercy of the filmmaker's design. And above all, the filmmakers want you to feel very bad. Remember the question I opened the video with. The point of a Final Destination movie is not to show you what you want to see, it's to show you exactly what you don't want to see. Like a famous roller coaster or a haunted house, they're the kinds of movies you would go to challenge yourself, to be able to say you could. Final Destination was almost a very different franchise because of its initial ending.
This was a reshoot, a significant reshoot. The audience was very clear in what they were responding to and what they did not like, and they did not like the original ending. They tore the seats of the theater and threw them at the screen.
In the original version, they take the whole new life defeats death thing they go on to use in the second movie, and the death cycle is broken when Alex sacrifices himself and Clear has a baby. It's dumb.
But then, you got to the pregnancy bit, and you could just tell, oops, I lost him.
Through the whole movie, they were having fun and yelling at the screen and jumping in their seats with the bus, with the flying head, with everything. And then the end, when Alex dies, they're just sitting there.
The audience response to this is a testament to the kind of movie a B movie can be, where fulfillment of narrative formula and tying up everything in a bow is less important than sustaining an interesting idea.
Sometimes you can shoot above the taste of an audience, which doesn't mean that you're smart and that they're not so smart, but means that there is a sort of Bible of entertainment which has certain tenets in it, and that this particular idea for the ending just shot above the taste level and the expectation level and the surprise level that the audience was looking for. And this sort of spiritual ending, which had to do with Clear having a child and having the child be the vindication of how you beat death, was perhaps a little too esoteric and not visceral enough for the public that we were trying to attract, which was arguably a postmodern scream crowd.
Notice that the ostensive goal is making the audience happy. Like, that's how they're explaining this decision. But what is the audience asking for? To feel bad, to feel disturbed, unfulfilled. Unlike any standard Hollywood narrative, every event in a Final Destination movie is optimized toward making you feel as stressed out as possible, and its plot will adjust itself in whatever way it must to sustain this core ethic of emotional ill will toward the audience. It's a series that refuses to give you a way out, which makes Tony Todd's scene in Bloodlines absolutely unforgivable. Let me explain myself. Tony Todd is a horror legend and a fixture in the Final Destination franchise as William Bloodworth, a coroner that appears in all the movies except the fourth and third, though his voice is featured in Final Destination 3.
You may never return from Devil's Light. Next stop is the end of the line.
William Bloodworth is mysterious. He knows more than he should. He's a guy who, at the very least, seems to revel in his own knowledge of how spooky he is.
Dead, yet still fresh.
The advice he gives people is frequently wrong, so much so that there's more than a little suggestion that he might actually himself be death.
You're at the cemetery, then the gym, now here? What are you doing?
In real life, Tony Todd died last year of cancer, which sucks. It's a huge loss. Final Destination Bloodlines was his last movie, and as an individual scene, I don't think an actor could ask for a better career capstone. In the movie, William Bloodworth proposes a theme for the franchise that also acts as Tony Todd's departing message as himself to the world.
We need your help. Where are you going?
I intend to enjoy the time I have left. Good luck.
It's really good. It's deeply touching, and it's a great tribute to who Tony Todd was as both a fellow human being and as a respected artist in his field. However, this is so absolutely not the theme of Final Destination. A person approaches you and says, "Oh my God, I can't stop being plagued by accidents with household objects to a truly supernatural degree. Every time I take a step, I almost get impaled or my face gets almost ripped off. I don't know what to do. Everybody around me is dying." And you say, "Take it easy, man. Live in the moment. Don't torture yourself this way." Death in Final Destination is not a construct. It is a very real and very conscious force that is actively pursuing you and whose ability to recombine itself in every moment makes it impossible to ignore, because if you do, you will die. Implying that the point of these movies is to convince you that any moment you can be taken out by a malfunctioning escalator, and so you should live each day to the fullest, is not wisdom, it is denial. That's why the only other time this Carpe Diem message is delivered is by one of the least likable douchebags in the worst movie of the franchise.
If you're right about this whole crash thing, then I'm going to make the most of every moment I have left. So I'm going to do what I do best. I'm going to go get laid.
That guy gets disemboweled through the ass by a pool drain. If characters in Final Destination can be said to be punished for anything, it is their attempt to rest and enjoy life to the fullest. Every single movie ends with a death that wasn't seen coming because everybody thought they were in the clear. Brinkema again. The films often conclude on this realization, cutting to black over the actual arrival of death, which is to say, the catastrophe given visual precedence in the closing moments is not the brutal transition to non-being, but the realization of the error of a premature abandonment of interpretation. The surviving characters' looks of horror, edited as shared glances of belated understanding, do not take as their objects pain or gore so much as the knowledge that they were not paranoid enough, but might have been, and now the surprise was able to take place. The fatal error each time is to have thought one was done with reading. Which also brings me to what might be Bloodline's biggest sin.
Now he's got me. Cancer. Oh.
Absolutely not. No. I'm sorry. What movie do you think we're in? This isn't Nom. This is Final Destination. There are rules. You do not get to kill yourself, and you certainly do not get to die a quiet death from cancer. Final Destination is, above all, a performatively cruel franchise. Anyone who's had to deal with cancer in their own life knows it's a cruel disease, but it's of a completely different type than the cruelty death as a character is trying to enact here. Cancer is intimately cruel, but Final Destination is dismissively cruel. It is the removal of agency, the disallowance of any opportunity to come to terms with your own death. This is a fundamental misreading from the filmmakers of their own franchise. Because these deaths are so spectacular, it's easy to assume that the point of death in Final Destination is suffering, but it really isn't. If my death were assured, right? Like all else being equal, if I knew for a fact that I was gonna die sometime in the next year, I would much rather be instantly killed by a speeding bus than experience a slow and excruciating decline from cancer. From death's perspective, it's all right if people suffer during the course of their demise, but suffering really isn't the goal. The goal is that someone, whether it be the person dying, a witness to that death, or the audience itself, feel that any opportunity to make peace with death in this situation has been denied with extreme prejudice.
If it is my time to go and be in heaven with my family, I can accept that.
To that end, there are two kinds of acceptable deaths in Final Destination: instant pulverization or conflagration, or a series of highly unlikely connected events, often referred to by people discussing the franchise as Rube Goldberg-esque. Rube Goldberg was an inventor and artist who made cartoons of machines designed to be overly complicated. The fun of a Rube Goldberg machine, the entire joke of it, is to build an invention that accomplishes an extremely simple task in the most convoluted way possible. The simpler the task at hand, and the more complicated the machine, the funnier the joke becomes. It's often noted that Final Destination is basically like if a slapstick cartoon were a horror movie, and this is true for the same reason you can't die of cancer in a Final Destination movie. Both the horrific version and the humorous version of this kind of violence function because they involve people becoming very closely acquainted with the world around them at a pace they are not allowed to be ready for. Let's take a classic death from Final Destination 2. Meet Evan Lewis. He's the luckiest guy in the world. He's just won the lottery and narrowly avoided a deadly pileup. He arrives at his shitty apartment with a bunch of gaudy luxuries he's just bought, sees a skillet of spaghetti out in the open for who knows how many days, and flings the spaghetti out the open window. He turns on the stereo, and in doing so marks a beginning of sorts, as often happens with the more complex Final Destination kills. The stage is set, the soundtrack applied, Let the fiasco begin. He takes the used skillet, piles some fish sticks into it, and turns on the stove. He then opens a box of leftover Chinese and puts it in the microwave, unaware that a refrigerator magnet has fallen into the box. He then opens his presents to himself as his answering machine repeats messages from gold-digging friends and past relationships. While admiring this dumb ring, he's startled by the microwave sparking in the background, and whoop, he drops the ring down the drain. Instead of dealing with the sparking microwave, he sticks his hand down the sink to get the ring, and your stomach drops as you're certain the garbage disposal is going to turn on somehow, but that's not what happens. What happens instead is that the fish sticks cook a little too long and burst aflame. With his hand still stuck in the sink, Evan grabs a washcloth and tries to beat the fire out. Instead, he knocks the skillet to the ground. Soon the whole apartment is on fire. He finally wrenches his hand out of the sink and pulls out the fire extinguisher, which doesn't work. He goes for the windows. They close, seemingly on their own. He smashes a window open and clambers onto the fire escape ladder just as his whole apartment explodes. But uh-oh, the ladder is stuck. He uses the momentum of his body weight to force it to move, and move it does, sending him plummeting to the ground. Surely this fall will cause his death. But he makes it, landing solidly on his feet, too relieved and baffled to think about his newfound homelessness. He steps away and immediately disappears from frame as he slips on the spaghetti he threw out the window a few minutes earlier. The fire escape falls within inches of Evan's face, and there is yet another brief moment of relief before it slips again and impales him through the eye. The relationship between horror and comedy is well known. We laugh at inappropriate situations and in inappropriate times because both horror and comedy rely on tension and release.
Or Isaac Palmer.
Did you just say my name? That's not funny.
People were the...
I talked about this a little bit a few years ago in my race horror video with Linda Williams' genres of excess idea, this concept that certain genres function by eliciting a physical response from you. So for Williams, melodrama, comedy, horror, and porn are all doing similar things. They make you cry, they make you laugh, they make you wince, they make you... This involuntary physical response is the reason these genres are typical B-movie fare. They're trying to get you to respond physiologically instead of intellectually. So adding aspects of one or more of these other genres to the one you're working within is a pretty intuitive and common thing to do. Final Destination is sometimes funny on purpose, and because of that, it's often grouped in with straightforward horror parodies like Scream and Scary Movie. And to the extent that Final Destination is playing with the audience's familiarity with horror movie tropes, this is valid. But it's a common misconception that because postmodernism is self-conscious about its own relationship to genre and medium, a postmodern story must necessarily be a parody or otherwise derisive of the conditions it's commenting on. Where Bloodlines fails is in its confusion of irony with comedy.
But that doesn't mean my eyes will see.
It isn't using the audience's knowledge of horror tropes to make fun of those tropes. It's using the audience's knowledge of Final Destination tropes to make fun of Final Destination. That's not good, because it means the standard for the movie's success will be based on how well the filmmakers can demonstrate their knowledge of the franchise through winks and nods to the audience, which is why there are no fewer than 3 log truck references in the movie, including the literal final shot. Like, the extent of this self-referentiality is enough to make one wonder how the first Final Destination made any money at all without other Final Destinations to refer to. Postmodernism is not the same thing as parody, and Final Destination is not and has never been a comedy. The tone of Final Destination is overall extremely serious. It is bitter, it is paranoid, and anhedonic. And it is sad. Its threat comes from disallowing any of the practical, ideological, or emotional exit routes that the audience expects to be available in a horror movie, not just from breaking bodies in new and unusual fashions. So, Rube Goldberg machines, systems that accomplish a simple task in the most complicated way possible. The death that causes the disasters in these movies is explicitly the same death that claims us all in the end. If these people escaped a plane crash and death needs them gone, it would be a very simple thing to just give them a heart attack or a stroke or something. For the conscious entity of death to kill someone should be the simplest task in the world, but Final Destination kills cannot, under any circumstances be structured this way, as a natural event or a quick, clean slide into nothingness. It must be complicated and unlikely and spectacular, because death is a joke in these movies. But it's not a joke we're in on. The joke is at our expense. Death is not laughing with us. It is laughing at us. Death could kill any of these people at any time, but it won't, because it needs its victims, including the audience, to feel like playthings. Your death is not even really so much a goal as a foregone conclusion. You're gonna die. What's important is that you, the audience, and all the characters in the movie see what the entity of death is capable of and feel just how outmatched you are. Death is not seeking a result. It's seeking respect. Well now, why would death need to go and do a thing like that? This gets at one of the aspects of Final Destination lore that's never explained. For all its obsession with patterns and timing, not a single Final Destination property wants to touch why these premonitions are happening in the first place. If you're familiar with my channel, you know this is not the kind of question I'm typically interested in. Final Destination isn't real, the premonitions happen so there can be a movie. But I'm struck by the things to which this franchise chooses to apply some kind of logic or reason, and I think there is a logical shape to how these movies want you to understand these premonitions. So there are basically three options for where the premonitions are coming from: death itself, an entity outside death, which we can call God, or the human brain. On first glance, one of these options is pretty easy to throw out, and that's God. The argument would go that God, however you want to conceptualize it, is giving the humans an edge in order to interfere with death's plan. Not convincing. If God is interrupting death's plan here, then this God is either incapable of interfering successfully in the world and is therefore not much of a power to contend with, or is seriously cruel and working in concert with death. I also just don't think this is supported by the text. The way these movies constantly talk about death having been cheated, the way everyone talks about how they were supposed to die. There's a plain acceptance of the premise that everyone here is living on borrowed time that pretty clearly positions death itself as the highest authority in the universe of the movie, who would be all-powerful were it not for these mysterious premonitions getting in its way. The alternative to this is that death is intentionally giving the premonitions to people for funsies, I guess, to make its job a little more interesting. That's plausible, but equally plausible and more interesting to me is the possibility that the premonitions are an accident, that something about the approach of death in any given situation causes a sort of temporal anomaly, which some intuitive or especially careful humans can pick up on and decipher. Either way, the role of God here transforms under this option. It isn't a matter of whether God is present or absent, it's a matter of how God, how divinity is incorporated into the other two options. Who is the more powerful deity in the modern material world? Humans or death?
And if I see it, then I intervene, and if I intervene, I change the design.
What, intervene? What are you, God now?
God's not afraid to die. Gods don't die. We do, you know?
From here we can backward engineer the ideological assumptions the Final Destination movies as postmodernist projects are disrupting and trying to shape anew. At the end of the American century, the general vibe for the average person in the United States was that humanity had conclusively figured itself out and would only get better from here. The go-to articulation of this attitude is political scientist Francis Fukuyama's 1992 book, The End of History, which argues that liberal democracies are the form of government humanity has been evolving toward and has, as of the late 20th century, conclusively won the right to control the trajectory of human civilization. As mankind approaches the end of the millennium, the twin crises of authoritarianism and socialist central planning have left only one competitor standing in the ring as an ideology of potentially universal validity: liberal democracy, the doctrine of individual freedom and popular sovereignty. The only thing left, according to Fukuyama, was to sustain this kind of ideological patience and generosity toward the potential of others, allow enough space for developing countries to catch up on the material standard of living of first world countries, and to expand the process of Enlightenment-style epistemology until we understand the nature of everything. The world has been revealed by science to be a knowable place, and we will, through global economic and scientific cooperation, eventually solve every conceivable problem. This is part and parcel of neoliberalism, the ideology that the key to ensuring future human well-being lies in well-managed market activity and wealth creation. The thought goes that the basic universal human impulse is to pursue rational self-interest, the furtherance of personal comfort and material satisfaction, and the minimization of bad social and physical consequences. All social ills result from a lack of agency to pursue these goals, is the idea. And so if we make a system that provides all that stuff by allowing people to pursue self-interest by cooperating with each other, lasting global peace is not only possible, but inevitable. Just as a side note, if you would like an actual on-the-ground study of neoliberal markets in action instead of Fukuyama's historical fan fiction, I'd recommend The Licit Life of Capitalism by anthropologist Hannah Appel, which studies the effective ownership of the entire country of Equatorial Guinea by the American oil industry, and which includes a devastating quote by a Chevron executive, "As long as we want cheap gas, democracy can't exist." Ugh. The totem of the neoliberal thought structure is stuff. Consumer goods. The items we purchase in our day-to-day in a consumer economy act as both an engine of liberal progress and a physical idol of its self-evident truth. While not every country is capable of becoming a consumer society in the near future, there is hardly a society in the world that does not embrace the goal itself, Fukuyama says. One of the most basic criticisms of this thought process is that people are, of course, not rational. We react to the world emotionally, not procedurally, and this is something consumer markets take advantage of all the time. Are advertisements just straightforward lists of the virtues of the product? No. Products sell themselves by telling you they'll make you happier, sexier, more secure, more successful, envied by those around you. Consumer goods are by and large items that require a certain amount of ignorance from purchasers about how they work. This is a large part of what sustains the allure of them, not only because a certain degree of ignorance is what encourages you to think of the human cooperation required to make and distribute them as a kind of black box magic, but because if you knew everything about how a car or a microwave worked, where the materials came from, the conditions of the people who make them, the landfill they end up in after you throw them away, some central part of the consumer economy illusion would be broken. It just wouldn't seem as convenient. And above all, consumer goods must be regarded as convenient. Consumer goods and services recreate the world around an expectation of ease of experience. Environmental storytelling is a thing in real life too, and the story your household goods tells you is this: you are in control. Unlike your ancestors, you will never want for anything. The fulfillment of all your needs is a relatively inexpensive purchase away. This world, and everything in it, is literally built for your convenience and enjoyment. And if you find something that isn't, well, that's an imperfection sure to be solved by future industrial ingenuity. Try to tolerate it until then. It's pretty difficult to overstate the relative newness of this interpretation of the meaning of objects. The idea that all the items we use are things that should rightfully be experienced as isolated individuals would be considered by most people of most cultures in world history extremely odd. Oh my God, I think it's raining. That's cool. I hope the mic doesn't pick it up. Okay, well, I guess we know the roof doesn't leak in here. Electrocuted on set, that's my final destination, death. Right, so stuff. Kind of weird in the history of human culture to regard stuff, objects, as just like individual items that you use and discard. In fact, in a lot of cultures, the disembodied nature of objects is itself kind of an assumed metaphysical threat. It's a problem to solve in order to protect society against the atomization and selfishness that follows from a purely utilitarian approach to the world. Objects need to be intentionally personified to correct this illusion that the human meaning of a thing begins and ends with how you personally use it. In some cultures, the most important objects we use would undergo some kind of ritual that would be understood to transfer this vibe vibe of human care to the object. The object takes on some quality of humanity exhibited by the people who made it and use it, and this is how an object becomes sacred. This is what a blessing is. The Eucharist, a ceremonial pipe, Japanese shide. These are all basic objects that through common agreement of what they mean become something more than they are. But if the opposite happens, if the humanity is intentionally taken out of the object and it becomes purely utilitarian, the only thing available to mystify is the object itself, impersonal, indifferent, and perhaps available for manipulation by sinister entities come to fill the vacuum where a friendly human presence would otherwise reside.
Yes, I own you, machine.
We in the modern age still rely on other people. It's just that the human care and labor we rely on is alienated through our mediated interactions with these objects that dissolve all evidence of a human hand through industrial infrastructure and machine logic. It might look like Clear is alone here, but she isn't. She relies on a network of hundreds of people to guarantee her illusion of isolated safety. You don't buy a chair from the local village craftsman anymore, and if you associate any kind of personality to the chair, you're likely to assign it to like Walmart or Wayfair, some entity that supplied your chair for you, but is somehow itself not really a person. There is no person. As far as you know, the chair made itself, I guess. Spooky. We return to anxiety. As described by film scholar James Hodge, anxiety names a felt non-relation to some sort of radically overdetermined nothing. The name for this nothing today is the network. For Heidegger, as for many other philosophers of anxiety, that nothing has to do with death. Importantly, death here is not an object toward which one feels anxiety, but rather what arouses anxiety. Death is instead a placeholder, an avatar, or a way of giving a name to something that can't properly be named, a kind of nothing or nowhere whose felt non-presence generates anxiety. This is what makes a Final Destination plot structure make sense despite its many logical non sequiturs. Oops, it turns out you're not the priority of the world. You are not in control. You might not experience war or material hardship, but the things you were told would give you comfort on this mortal coil are actually inanimate objects. They cannot care about you. And if you perish in an accident of this grand machine, if you are obliterated by a routine failure of some indifferent link in the supply chain, they will have no thoughts about it. But all is not lost, because as with every problem in a fundamentally knowable world, there's an algorithm for that. Death attacks every victim in a specific order, the order they would have died in the original accident. If there's a system, there must be a way to hack it. So just figure out the vulnerability in death's design and you're free.
Does that mean if you figure out the design, you can cheat death?
But all this does is introduce more uncertainty, more panic, because death will always be a better coder than you are. Every second is a new battle against a tireless enemy. Every vanquished Rube Goldberg machine just sets up a new one. You can kill someone else and gain their life, but that person was due to die in a few days from a brain aneurysm anyway, because there will always be one more possible joke, and death dearly loves to laugh. There is no mode of possibility in Final Destination for disordering the intentional functional dimension of design without putting in play a different aesthetic design. That latter mode is marked by infinitude. For in this franchise about what is fundamentally terminable and terminated, what is interminable is design as such. Death names not an event, but the specific possibility of no longer being able to be there. Design, likewise, does not name a fixed formal event, but rather the possibility, plan, protocol, or yet to be formalized nature of some future making or taking shape. Design names the possibility of the being able to be there of form itself. It's crazy making. A never-ending, self-perpetuating, cyclonic machine with no obvious purpose other than to fuck your shit up. A few weeks ago, I had to flee a tornado. This is not a new experience for me, being as I am from the most historically tornado-infested part of the country, but having left Tornado Alley and recently returned, I am struck anew by how ridiculous it is that every now and then the sky opens up and extends an enormous hand and clumsily smashes everything in its path like a 2-year-old kicking an anthill. Tornadoes are such utter chaos that it's easy to forget how insubstantial they actually are. They're just air. Changes in air pressure caused by volatile ambient temperatures forces the wind into these funnels that have nowhere to go but just straight into the ground. When you're looking at a tornado, you are not looking at an object so much as a series of knock-on effects. The dirt and vapor and pieces of things and creatures caught in this nightmare carousel that chews up everything it contacts and revolves around absolutely nothing at all. It's not really the tornado that kills you, it's the piece of housing foundation or window shard or tree limb the tornado flings at the fragile creme brulee shell that is your skull. There is no actual substance to a tornado. It feels like you shouldn't even be able to see one. And yet, if you're from here, you know tornadoes aren't just natural disasters. They're monsters. Somehow, beyond all reason, even if you know exactly what they are and are not, tornadoes feel animated by something. They have personality. When we look at a tornado, we are looking at the physical presence of a void, and we are finding that not only can a void behave, but its nature, far from being benign backdrop, is always ready to break containment, and when it does, is so directed and vicious that it may as well be interpreted as actively malevolent. There is a crouching malice in there that is impossible to defeat because being at its core nothing, this volatility, this destructive chaos is inherently part of the universe and therefore inherently a part of us. Cool. Depending on your cultural background, one potential reaction could be to make a god out of this. Not out of the tornado itself necessarily, but of the mystery it implies, this existential epiphany that what you're looking at is beyond you somehow, and that in its beyondness, you unexpectedly discover something about yourself. This is really nicely explained in an episode of novelist Michael Judge's podcast, Death is Just Around the Corner.
It is only recently that we have become so fucking diseased as to identify God with a series of abstract concepts or a series of attributed acts that are meant to prove his supremacy. No, God, as long as there's been God, except just till now, has been an immanent power working in the world. And when I say that, I do not mean a God who makes decisions about human fate and rewards some people and punishes others. No, not at all. For the vast majority of human history, what God has meant is a way to name and talk about a cycle you see in nature, a power you see in nature, a form of energy that repeats and repeats and repeats. The idea that the Greeks, for example, believed in a set of mythical beings and had special stories about all of them, and every once in a while believed those mythical beings, came to Earth or whatever and did them a favor or hurt them. That is not just wrong, not just stupid, but really quite insulting and really quite an effective way to damage the human mind's capability to think about anything but the present moment. Because, using the Greeks, since people will be familiar with them, they wrote of a, quasi-anthropoid being called Athena coming to Telemachus to tell him to do something or say something, because that was the language available at the time. If you think that's what they literally mean, you're out of your fucking mind. You will see it described elsewhere as just, oh yeah, here's the goddess of being smart, came out of a forehead or whatever, and also some olive trees, some owls, we don't know what that's about. No. All of that adds up to the same thing. Flash, shine, eye, idea, spark of inspiration. This is what Athena means. Athena is not a woman who lives on a fucking mountain and has more or less unimportant desultory stories about her. Athena is the moment of suddenly having a blindingly bright, penetrating insight out of nowhere. It is the moment of being absolutely baffled, struggling with all your normal reasoning, logical processes, and then suddenly going, holy fuck, I've got it. I fucking got it. Being visited by Athena, being in contact with Athena, means having the inexplicable flash of insight, where suddenly something baffling and confusing makes perfect sense to you. That is what is going on in the Odyssey. That is what is going on in all the Homeric books, the pseudo-Homeric poems, everything we have recorded from that era. The presence of, a sort of human-like woman is just a device to get across the idea that there is this power in nature which sends you those flashes of insight. But the flash of insight itself is Athena, and we have been taught this wrong and backwards for God fucking knows how long.
This is my favorite theory for how religions are developed, and I have yet to see anything in the anthropological literature that contradicts it. Like, people 2,000 years ago or whatever weren't stupid. They were the same species as us. They understood metaphor. Gods are not fantasies. They're self-conscious reflections. They're models onto which we project our internal search for meaning through a very serious form of play, through telling stories, through explaining our own experiences to each other in a way that we hope will make our interlocutors understand how we feel about it. This is why it's so dumb that our culturally dominant understanding is that animistic pantheism is somehow inherently less evolved than monotheism, as if the kind of personification you choose to represent the unknowable is a direct indicator of whether your approach to spirituality will be defined by fear and reactiveness or by care and introspection. Like, be honest, when you think of a primitive religion, is what comes to mind people contemplatively confronting the unknowability of their place in the universe? Or is it a derogatory image of panicky idiots who literally think they'll be invincible if they wear the right color and sacrifice the right goat? When you conjure an image of a typical Christian, is it these people?
We're right there. Show you the creative power of God right now, and the authority of a believer. In the name of Jesus, you get back up into the sky. Right now. You will not touch down. In Jesus' Go back name. up. Right now.
Because these two things are the same thing. And so is this. Final Destination is nothing less than the holy text of the early 2000s.
We are all equal in death's eyes.
Like all holy scripture, its cosmology is presented obliquely as a fable, and the characters within are its fundamentalists. The idea, as with every mythos, is to get you to perceive something that disappears as soon as you look at it or speak about it explicitly.
This fear is more than just being scared. It's like a presence. Like a living thing, always with me.
In a society that had studiously and clinically removed the immanence of everything that is possible to ignore in this life, we were left contending with a single deity, the only thing we couldn't stop experiencing every waking moment. Death made manifest in an infinite permutation of risks through the very commodities designed to deny its authority, whose overwhelming non-presence rendered us as neurotic and agitated as pacing zoo animals. A creature with nothing to worry about worries about everything. Thus do we arrive back where we started. A postmodern artist or writer is in the position of a philosopher. The text he writes, the work he produces, are not in principle governed by pre-established rules, and they cannot be judged according to a determining judgment by applying familiar categories to the text or work. Those rules and categories are what the work of art itself is looking for. The artist and the writer then are working without rules in order to formulate the rules of what will have been done. Hence the fact that work and text have the characters of an event. Hence also, they always come too late for their author, or what amounts to the same thing, they're being put into work. Their realization always begins too soon. Postmodernism would have to be understood according to the paradox of the future post anterior. modo. Future past. What do we do under these conditions? What rules do we govern ourselves by to bear this unbearability? All religions of all cultures have the capacity for wisdom, insight, and self-actualization, just as they all carry the potential for cruelty, delusion, and self-obsession. The church of stuff that shaped the late 20th century, what communications professor Robert McChesney has termed market theology, reluctant to tell us the truth about its own ethical principles, produced through the instinctive, physiologically embodied structure of the B-movie, a new belief structure governed by a single deity, malicious in its superior calculation and vengeful toward these glorified apes who thought their little inventions made them immortal. It doesn't matter how much you know about a system designed to kill you. Your rationality will not save you. And in the end, you will be just as afraid and just as alone as if you knew nothing.
Death is just the end of biological function. It's as simple as that.
The lesson of this theology is characteristically cold and harsh, but it is a lesson nonetheless. It's that living life to the fullest is the hardest thing you will ever do. You will do it incorrectly, you will fail often, and then you will, someday, fail ultimately. You can't get out of this situation, but it's important that you try. It's important that you take your physical existence seriously and protect it with sincerity and a straight face. Within this cosmology, the behavioral ethic this scripture begrudgingly seems to give us is that in order to actually gain any kind of stability in this chaotic death trap of a world, we must rely on each other. The conditions of Final Destination do not imply that we should simply stop worrying. It implies that other people's lives, in every best and worst way, will come to define your own. The commonality among the characters in every Final Destination movie is their lack of commonality. There's usually some kind of romantic interest or close tie, but most of these people are strangers or close to it.
We wouldn't have even hung out. We don't even like each other.
No one person here has much reason to care that deeply about anybody else, except that everybody else's potential death makes one's own that much closer. Suddenly, this common cause has turned everyone into members of the same tribe, and through this, their eventual deaths gain profound meaning to each other, far deeper and more important to everybody left alive than they would otherwise be.
I'll just be freaking out every second, hoping you're okay.
Why? We don't even like each other.
Not in Bloodlines, though. Bloodlines just makes everybody in the Death Tribe family to begin with. Why do this? How did it become intuitive for a Final Destination cast to be comprised of the only modern relationship dynamic that is assumed to be deeply invested in each other's lives and deaths? Similarly, why does the world Bloodlines takes place in feel so timeless? The other Final Destination movies are, as is common for B-movies, hopelessly dateable to the time periods they were filmed in. The costume design and the character archetypes are instantly recognizable as being from a particular time in history. 5 gets a pass because it's trying to disguise its time period and does so pretty convincingly. This is going to sound like a nitpick, but I think it actually does matter. The opening disaster in Bloodlines is supposed to take place in 1968. Okay. But this isn't 1968. The styles of 1968 look more like the 70s than the 50s. This is the fashion and music of the very early 60s. My grandmother dressed like this, and I am 32 years old. In order to place the opening disaster in the explicitly stated 50 years before the current day, it would have to take place in 1975. I like all the people in Bloodlines. I think their dialogue is well written and well acted. I like their chemistry with each other. I like Paco. Look at me, look at my face. I love Paco. But these people seem completely divested from any recognizable American experience outside this vaguely post-Reaganite setting that might anchor their deaths in a world where death actually feels consequential. Bloodlines doesn't want to be a Final Destination movie. Or perhaps Final Destination just doesn't represent an accessible anxiety for the average person anymore. Why would it? Today, the only people allowed to be obsessed with this dreamlike avoidance of death through individualist convenience and technological optimism consumerism are people with a lot of money. The rest of us are cut loose from the presumption of even a clear life plan. We are expected to be as malleable, adaptable, and interchangeable as the economy needs us to be, and temper our expectations for individual identity and satisfaction accordingly. Nobody in Bloodlines seems to have much of a life outside this particular event. They don't seem to need to be anywhere else or have a plan for themselves beyond this specific family emergency, except in the opening disaster, which is aesthetically portrayed as kind of a parody of a life plan, a simulacrum of post-war affluence and cheer that we just don't relate to in a way that makes it seem anchored in a real time and place anymore. The possibility of dying is only upsetting if you have somewhere else to be, and an increasing number of us have no idea where we should be. Far from being an obstacle, death is the only way out. It's our retirement plan, it's our escape from debt. Half our memes are jokes about how much we yearn for the grave. No longer are we all equal in death. Instead of something assumed to have been drowned out by modern convenience, death appears to be bribable, entirely present, but neutralized through sheer force of apathy. Just another asset to be capitalized upon by some and weaponized against everybody else.
So, people are not, well, we all are going to die. So, for heaven's sakes.
I made an incorrect assumption that everyone in the auditorium understood that, yes, we are all going to perish from this earth. So I apologize. And I'm really, really glad that I did not have to bring up the subject of the tooth fairy as well.
The postmodern has become modern. In Bloodlines, it's revealed that even the ever-presence of death, the great sequel generator that kept this franchise afloat, is maybe not quite so powerful or infinite to begin with anyway. Kimberly, who drowned and was then revived in Final Destination 2, is revealed as canonically alive, making the deleted scene in Final Destination 3 that reveals her death officially and conclusively deleted, and the death algorithm functionally solved. So why are we here exactly? To watch a bunch of decent people suffer and consider ourselves proudly on the side of the force that destroys them? Don't get me wrong, right? Like, I enjoy watching a well-executed kill as much as the next degenerate, but the comparison between how we're accepting this series as an audience now compared to 20 years ago disturbs me, I have to say. What does it say about us that we've abandoned even the pretense that there are some things beyond our reckoning or ability to control, even as we continue to suffer and perish? What does it mean that we've softened our recognition of the cruelty involved in our existence, but not the material harm? And creepiest of all, what does it say that this interpretation, far from being the transgressive, subconscious desire of the popular id, is confidently affirmed by mainstream culture as both appropriate and enjoyable, a good and proper way to think of life's meaning or lack thereof. Before, we disrespected death by thinking we had materially transcended it. Now we disrespect death by delusionally thinking of death as an ally, like a duckling imprinting on a fox. We have come to terms with the simultaneous gift and curse of mortal consciousness, not by surrendering to its imminence and turning our attention to what kinds of agency remain possible, but by abandoning any claim or concern for agency to begin with. Where before we were caught in the twister's self-sustaining chaos, desperately grasping around for something to hold on to, now we stand outside it, watching this howling wall of ruin creep closer with our phones out, giddy not at the thrill of being so close to something so powerful and destructive, but at the thought of how much engagement your death is going to get when the glass and bricks and logs you see ripping through the air finally collide with your body. Maybe your family will inherit some ad revenue. It's weird, isn't it? How fast we decided nothing's worth the time it takes to care about it. How stagnant everything is. I would like to live in a world where 25 years feels like a long time again, you know? Where 2025 feels as different from 2000 as 2000 does from 1975. That's the kind of nostalgia I'm interested in, I guess, just like a functional progression of cultural identity. It's time we made some new gods. Death was a shitty god to begin with, and I don't buy the idea that snuggling up to it and calling it cute is as transgressive as New Line and Warner Brothers seem to want me to think. Make some trash. It's all gonna get swept away in the eons anyway. Make some trash! Show me the world I live in instead of just the world with its face done up all pretty. I know artists watch this channel, pull out your garbage can, and dig around for the shit you threw away because you knew it wouldn't sell, and make it. The real trash. Don't give me irony. Don't nudge me in the shoulder every 5 minutes. Just pick the most embarrassing thing you care about, the thing you think no one else thinks about or notices or wants to hear or see, and make me some trash out of it. And I don't mean procedurally generated bullshit. Trash is different from slop. Slop is lazy and proud to be so, and I have no patience for pretenders at creativity. Make some trash. Make it from the heart, and go with the knowledge that making trash is a very brave and noble thing, especially now. You might not spawn a multi-million-dollar franchise, but you will show people who they actually were when they were pretending to be civilized. Your death is fast approaching. Every day it comes closer. You don't have to be afraid of it. It's not 2003 anymore, but it should matter. Make it matter. Make some trash.